Hi, my name is Meredith, and this is my personal story and statement about narcissism. The views and opinions represented are my own. My intention is not to label any specific individuals or institutions, but rather to add insight and perspective from my own experience and memory. I am not a therapist, but perhaps just uniquely qualified. I am a survivor of narcissistic abuse. It is an abusive behavior that comes with narcissistic personality disorder, also known as NPD, which exists along a spectrum from mild to severe, with the worst case being NPD. I'd like to share my personal story in hopes of helping others who have been touched by this condition in their relationships, because it can affect anyone. Male, female, old, young, mothers, fathers, siblings, children, husbands, wives, romantic partners, anyone. And victimization can begin young, like when people are starting to date in their teens. Even before then, young children pick up on the destructive patterns in the home. Right now, someone in your life could be compromised and suffering. I'm extremely passionate about proclaiming a message about narcissism. I want to shout out the warning that this disorder does not discriminate in terms of its victims. It's an insidious disorder, kind of like invisible. And that, for me, resulted in mental and emotional and physical damage. As a result of my own trauma, my body has been in a state of hypervigilance, also known as fight or flight, for decades. I want to make others aware of a destructive cycle where years can pass with health issues and emotional wear and tear, with lasting psychological markers. Imagine having gone through something in the past that was extremely uncomfortable, basically unbearable, but it keeps coming back, and every time it does, you can't avoid thinking about it. So you end up having to relive the trauma over and over. Well, that's the reality of the effects of long-term exposure to someone who has NPD. It happens all day, every day, that unavoidable feeling. I know of situations where people have been married for as long as 45 years, struggling in a seemingly hopeless situations, not realizing that narcissist personality disorder was at play. Most believe that they could fix the relationship or love it away, not understanding the reality of what and who they were up against. Even with the knowledge, some choose to stay in it because of finances, children, custody concerns, culture, religion. And tragically, the only way out for many is suicide or very few other avenues of escape. But along with exposing the traits of NPD and negative consequences of exposure to it, I want to share my personal growth and some positive insights. Though I am left with some emotions of resentment and anger, I've also emerged with knowledge, wisdom, insight, and skills to aid and inspire others. My story begins with being adopted at 2 weeks old by a couple in New York. At the time, they were 25 and 50, Dad being a much older gentleman. When I was 5, my family, which by then included my 3-year-old adopted sister, moved to St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. Along my journey of healing from NPD exposure, I realized that I suffered from emotional deficiencies from an early age, and realized that most of my issues evolved from having parents who were themselves emotionally unavailable. My adopted mother was an alcoholic who exerted mental, emotional, and physical abuse upon my sister and me. I later discovered that she had also suffered at the hands of an abusive mother. Sadly, the woman who raised me succumbed to her disease at only 44 years of age. And for a month before she died, I would leave school early and go to the hospital to feed her, because she had stopped eating for the nurses. Tragically, my adopted father suffered a stroke a month later. He was 68 at the time and remained in poor health for the rest of his life. So at 17, the cares of adolescence were replaced with adult responsibilities, and I never was able to grow into or express my authentic self. The job of caring for my ailing father and 15-year-old sister was now mine. I also had to run the family business, pay bills. Among them was a mortgage. Putting it mildly, it was a lot. Looking back, it's hard to imagine how I managed to graduate from the Catholic high school, but somehow I did. It felt like the entire world was thrown at me all at once. Having to grow up so quickly, coupled with the fact that my 17 years hadn't been spent growing up as a typical carefree child, but instead dealing with emotionally immature parents. It left me extremely vulnerable with very little self-esteem and a low sense of self-worth. I'd grown into a people pleaser and a highly sensitive person with codependency issues. At that point, I was putting other people's needs ahead of my own. At the expense of my own well-being and boundaries, that word meant nothing to me except for something having to do with offense. After high school graduation, I watched my friends all leave St. Thomas for college on the mainland, but my own dreams and personal ambition didn't matter. I couldn't leave my father behind. Being 2,000 miles away and unable to easily reach him, that was out of the question. Though he'd never been able to stand up to our mother, he was a sweetheart and I loved him. There wasn't much help for his condition or a recovery program that was easily accessible in St. Thomas, but I did my best to care for him as well as my sister while running the family business. I ultimately stayed in St. Thomas another 20 years, got married, and started my own family. As a teenager, even before my mother died, I began running to men for comfort and for what I thought was love. At 15, I was sneaking out of the house, going downtown St. Thomas to the local nighttime establishments. Incidentally, it was during the late 70s, so it was relatively safe. But I'm embarrassed to admit that I found older men to assuage my pain. I looked for love in all the wrong places, searching for what I didn't get from my mom. I learned years later that I was actually attracted to what was familiar to me, toxic relationships. But in retrospect, I know that I was looking for love and acceptance. When I was 19, I met a man twice my age one Sunday on a local beach. A year later, I married him and we eventually had 3 kids. Again, looking back, I remember all the fears surrounding my life. Responsibility for my sick father and younger sister, the house and business. I guess I was just looking for a life raft to save me. Time passed and the desire to find my biological parents grew, especially my real mother. Since being told at the age of 7 years old that I was adopted, whenever my mom was especially cruel, I would cry out at night and wish for my fairy godmother to show up and take me away. But after searching online through Vital Statistics of New York and working with an adoption coach, I was able to locate my biological mother. Then she in turn provided information about my biological father. So at the age of 38, I finally realized that dream, having them fly down to the Virgin Islands to meet me. I learned that I was my biological mother's only child and my biological father's only daughter. I also quickly learned that they were both established and very busy in their own lives, dad with his family and mom with running her business. But I was blessed to have them each come to visit me many times separately with their own spouses. They both lived on the East Coast, and getting to know them only made me want to be closer. It was especially important for me to have a relationship with my biological mother and spend as much time with her as I could. But what was quickly apparent is that you can't spend decades apart from a biological parent and then expect to piece everything together quickly and neatly. Therapy was needed in order to work through trauma resulting from my upbringing with my adopted mother, as well as to address the longing that I had for the connection with my biological mother. So after being offered to start my therapy journey, I gladly accepted the offer and did the therapy on my own. Due to the difficulty of the inner child work that I needed to do, I continued to struggle with the intimate connection that I was looking for. By the time all this happened, I was married for the second time and had another child, but still I wasn't happy. My husband and I were not compatible, and I felt trapped. Life was so busy with being a wife, a mother, and running the family business. I never had time for myself or to get the therapy I needed. Everyone else needed so much from me, so how could I? But on our travels to the mainland, I began organizing stepping stones for a permanent move to the States to get out of St. Thomas and leave so many terrible memories behind. I moved to the beaches of Jacksonville, Florida, because having left St. Thomas, I felt like a fish out of water. I hadn't lived in the States before the age of 5, before my adopted parents moved my sister and me to the Caribbean. But even in this new environment, I found myself still looking for love in all the wrong places. I can only describe how I felt as like a wounded bird, vulnerable and extremely sensitive. I was a person with a caregiving mentality and empathetic nature, and not a bad-looking woman with, unfortunately, no sense of boundaries. I continued to attract toxic personalities, not knowing then that I was dealing with that seemed to be narcissism. In my compromised emotional state, each person took advantage and manipulated me. At that stage in life, I didn't realize that many bad people are master manipulators. I just knew that those who were emotionally abusive to me never accepted any responsibility. Nothing was ever their fault. At the beginning, each would appear to be charming and acting one way in public, but entirely differently behind closed doors. In the beginning, they offered companionship and seemed so loving, kind, and willing to listen. One of the characters in my ongoing saga turned out to be an overt narcissist that I had to put a restraining order on. Again, back then I had no knowledge or understanding of the term of what the disorder actually entailed. With that particular individual, I saw things playing out like with Jodie Foster and John Hinckley's situation, the guy becoming obsessed with the girl and growing desperate to try and impress her, going to an extreme, almost deadly. In Hinckley's case, it was the attempted assassination of a president. During one of my last relationships, the light bulb finally came on and began to recognize and take note of the patterns. I researched to find information about the things that were continuing to happen to me, things like gaslighting and passive-aggressive behavior. During my last few months with him, I logged details about his behavior every day and discovered there were symptoms of different forms of narcissism. I knew that even before him, I'd been a victim of each form: covert, vulnerable, classic, overt, and communal. I must have been a walking target for narcissistic abuse. This man was much older than me, and just like many others, in the beginning he was charming and kind, treated me so well, and acting out another term I became familiar with, love bombing. And what girl doesn't want a man treating her well? Plus, he reminded me of my adoptive father, an older gentleman and a sweetheart. But also, like the others, the sweetheart eventually became a devil. In the midst of the abuse, I found myself drinking heavily, which eventually landed me in a recovery program. But thankfully, this time I realized that was happening and was part of a reoccurring cycle, and for my own sake, I was taking note. A common manipulative tactic in abusive relationships is for the perpetrator to portray their partner as crazy or unstable. This is a way to isolate the victim, control their reality, and undermine their sense of self, often causing them to doubt themselves and believe that they are the crazy one. But my journaling and doing self-inventory helped me to learn more about myself as well as narcissism. I learned that it represents patterns of behavior and not just somebody having an off day or being an asshole, or a jerk here and there. I also realized that I dealt with several of what seemed to be narcissists in my life, including women. For a large part of my life, I'd been the perfect target for these manipulative predators. They typically prey upon those who are mentally or emotionally vulnerable, have few, if any, boundaries, are highly sensitive and empathetic, and exhibit neediness. Victims don't even have to come from a traumatic childhood background like mine, but could be someone who had the most wonderful upbringing. For example, a victim might be a successful person, but someone without real solidified boundaries and just has something that the narcissist is attracted to, something they can get, a means to an end. Doing research and collecting data on my own allowed me to understand more about the traits and habits of perpetrators and what I was dealing with. In the perpetrator's game, the victim is just a tool to garner attention and validation to fuel their ego. It's known as a narcissist supply. This supply is the drug the narcissist is addicted to in order to feed their false self, or mask, avoid facing their true self, and is shame attached to it. Narcissism is actually a shame disorder, and narcissistic supply is what the perpetrator gets from others who try and avoid the deep-rooted shame that lies beneath their grandiosity. Narcissists also often fear being unloved, unwanted, and manipulating others to provide the acceptance they crave as part of the narcissistic supply relationship. When a victim does move on and is no longer providing the supply, the narcissist tends to feel threatened and insecure. If they see any chance of drawing the victim back in, they will often resort to a behavior known as hoovering, which is an attempt to lure them back through guilt, manipulation, or false promises. These predators are generally described as having a sense of superiority or self-importance, a constant need for admiration, low to no empathy, and a sense of entitlement, and will also exhibit exploitive behavior. To them, relationships are largely superficial. Knowing the forms and signs of NPD can help in gauging the severity of a situation and deciding what actions are appropriate for self-preservation. Each of the following forms exhibit traits in basically all predators. Here are just some of the main types. 1. Overt, classic, grandiose, marked by arrogance, an inflated sense of self-importance, and a strong need for admiration. A second one might be covert, hidden, characterized by passive-aggressive but subtle and charming behavior. The perpetrator is likely to be hypersensitive to criticism. They will also use manipulation and gaslighting. It's considered hidden, behind the scenes. Malignant, which is the most severe form and considered to be the highest level. It often exists alongside antisocial personality disorder, exhibits aggression, lack of empathy, and a tendency to exploit others for personal gain. Malignant narcissists can also be highly suspicious and paranoid. Becoming familiar with the stages of narcissism is also important for navigating a relationship with an infected person. Some stages are: 1. Love bombing, intense infatuation and showering of affection, could be gifts, trips, which can go on for months. Devaluing, love bombing ceases, no more idolizing. 3. Discarding, dismissal, or a divorce. NPD also has its own vocabulary, which a victim might at first recognize simply as words describing normal, everyday relationship challenges. But gaslighting is a form of manipulation where someone is made to doubt their reality, keep them in a state of confusion, and manipulating their emotions, even manipulating the meaning of words and deliberately twisting, reinterpreting to control or destabilize another person, kind of like a word salad. Triangulation is a tactic where a narcissist tries to create conflict within a relationship. Passive aggressiveness is an indirect way of expressing anger and hostility instead of openly addressing it. A flying monkey is someone taking extreme measures to monitor and control the activities and movements of another, sometimes working as an aid to the narcissist. It's estimated that only 1 to 6% of NPD cases are recorded. And that's because obviously the vast majority who are sick with it are not going to stand up and say, I have a problem, and then go get therapy. Due to a lack of understanding or acceptance of the seriousness of the disorder, judges, courts, even the church often don't recognize narcissism and fail to effectively protect victims. Sadly, some therapists and counselors may even lack the comprehensive understanding necessary to successfully treat or deal with it. But today I'm proud and grateful to not only be a survivor of NPD, but a thriver. I came to a point where I had to answer the question, do you want to let it go and be happy, or hold on to it and continue to suffer? I chose to let it go and become a survivor. And as a survivor, willing to share my journey and to turn my mess into a message and my tragedy into a testimony. To those who believe they are in or have been in a damaging relationship with a narcissist, I urge you to prioritize self-preservation. To anyone who may be noticing some or all of the signs I've mentioned, I say don't just keep collecting the red flags. Become educated about what you're experiencing and protect yourself from anyone perpetrating narcissistic behaviors. I highly recommend and suggest reading and listening to Dr. Romani D'Ursula, also known as Dr. Romani, who is a leading expert on narcissism, particularly NPD and its impact on relationships. My Facebook page, Narc Angel, which is all uppercase, Narc Angel, offers short-form videos and other informational posts. I have hopes to build a website that will also offer many resources to educate and understand this insidious disorder, as well as to start Zoom meetings to provide a safe space to share your experience and learn from each other. You're not alone, as I'm right there with you, and I'm learning about this too. Find the courage to reach out to others for help and seek advocates to genuinely lend assistance in extracting you from harm. You are absolutely deserving of a full life with true love and healthy relationships. As for me, I am happy to say I am sober, still in my recovery programs, and living with a sense of freedom. Please reach out to me, and thank you for listening. Meredith.